Hello, and welcome to Strategic Energy Group's Building Operator Smart series of educational videos on shaping up your building to be a high performer. This video is named Running Your Building with the Brakes On, Part 2. But before we get started, remember, for additional energy reducing tips for your building, please subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. My name's Steve Hathaway, and I'm an energy coach with Strategic Energy Group, and I'll be presenting today's video. This video is a continuation of our previous video discussing opportunity number 3 of the 4 common opportunities that we often find in buildings. In this second episode of our 2-part video, we delve deeper into the various ways that simultaneous heating and cooling can happen in commercial buildings. As we mentioned in the previous video, simultaneous heating and cooling is one of the most wasteful forms of HVAC operations. It's kind of like driving your car with the brakes always on. When it's allowed to persist, simultaneous heating and cooling can create a twofold increase in energy consumption in commercial buildings. In our last video, part 1 of simultaneous heating and cooling, we mentioned how some of the older HVAC systems were actually designed to always operate heating and cooling simultaneously. But most buildings constructed within the last 40 years or so tend to utilize what are known as variable air volume, single path air handlers for their HVAC systems. These air handlers tend to be much more efficient as they're designed to temper only a single stream of air that gets either heated or cooled. They feed the conditioned air out to the various zones of the building at a temperature chosen to provide air just cool enough to keep their zones from overheating. Out in the various zones of the building, there are variable air volume terminal boxes that specifically control the amount of supply air fed to each zone. These terminal boxes will frequently have reheat coils in them that will allow them to raise their air temperature of their specific zone should it have a problem maintaining the zone's comfort set point warm enough. So let's take a look at how these newer systems are more efficient, yet not necessarily immune to allowing simultaneous heating and cooling to happen when things aren't operating correctly. First, let's start by reviewing the basics of a typical modern air handler system. Here we have a graphic depicting a typical single-path air handler. The return fan draws air back from the building to be conditioned, in other words, reheated or cooled as needed. And in this case, most of the returning air is drawn through the return air damper, while a small portion is being exhausted. The return air then gets mixed with fresh air being drawn in from outside in what's called the mixed air plenum. It then passes through a bank of filters and then across the heating and cooling coils to get pressurized as it passes through the fan, leaving the air handler as conditioned supply air, and is then distributed out to the various zones that it serves. Now, let's go a little deeper. In this example, the temperature of the air returning from the zones, denoted here as RAT for return air temperature, is 72 degrees. The outside air temperature, denoted as OAT, over on the left side of the screen, is showing that it's 35 degrees. And the outside air damper is at 45% open, and it's controlling how much cool outside air is being drawn in. The combining of the cool outside air and the warm return air results in a mixed air temperature of 55 degrees. Currently, the supply air temperature set point is also a constant 55 degrees. And the system is performing properly per command, mixing the right amount of warm return air with cool outside air to maintain a constant supply air temperature of 55 degrees. Because this air handler utilizes what's called a fixed supply air temperature, the supply air temperature set point does not automatically adjust. If it needs to provide warmer or cooler supply air, it must be manually adjusted. Now, let's take a look at how simultaneous heating and cooling often happens even in a single path air distribution system like this. Out in the building will be a number of terminal boxes receiving supply air from the fan and serving the various zones throughout the building. And here's one which has a reheat coil that provides the final stage of heating to the zone as needed. Notice that the hot water reheat valve is open at 60% and it's discharging 85-degree air as it works to keep the space temperature at set point. Without the heat from the reheat coil, this space would become too cool, and operating this way, the zone is maintained at the desired set point. Under cold outside air conditions like this, reheat will be needed at many of the terminal boxes. So now the question is, should the air handler supply air temperature set point remain at 55 degrees under these conditions? In general, no. During cold weather, the lower the supply air temperature, the higher the reheat penalty is. So let's see how that works. Let's make a change with the controls and move the supply air set point upwards in temperature to 65 degrees. And let's see what happens throughout the system. Notice how the outside air damper now drops to only 15% open. This decreases the amount of cold outside air being brought in and utilizes more of the warm return air. And then notice the mixed air and supply air temperatures have now risen to 65 degrees. So we've managed to raise the supply air temperature 10 degrees from 55 to 65 degrees, and without any supplemental heating needed from the air handler's heating coils. Now, let's look and see what's happening out at the terminal unit. The terminal unit is now receiving that 65-degree supply air, and the hot water reheat valve has now dropped to only 10% open, where previously it had been maintained at 60% open. Yet the terminal unit is still able to supply the 85-degree air needed to maintain the zone at set point. So this little change in supply air temperature can result in using much less reheat energy throughout the whole system. So when heat is required in most of the zones, keep the supply air temperature up in its set point range and lower it only as the need for cooling becomes predominant, such as in late spring and summer. Early on, many of these systems were originally designed to use a constant supply air set point of 55 degrees, no matter what the heating and cooling loads were. But nowadays, with the much better control systems we have, these old, fixed supply air temperature set points are considered wasteful. That low of supply air is usually only needed during the warm weather of summer, and as a result, only drives up reheat costs during the other seasons. This graph depicts a simple, automated supply air temperature reset strategy that's used by many systems these days. It resets the air handler's supply air temperature based on the current outside air temperature. It's a simple but very effective strategy that helps minimize the need for reheat out of the terminal boxes. It keeps the supply air temperature up around 65 degrees until the time that the building just begins to need cooling, usually as the outside air temperature rises to around 50 to 55 degrees. And then it steps the supply air temperature downwards slowly, providing cooler air as the outside air temperature increases, finally reaching its lowest set point of 55 degrees. A better, more complex strategy is becoming more popular these days, which continually monitors the building's heating and cooling loads, watching either the average building temperature or the cooling valve positions out at the air handlers. It then adjusts the supply air set point automatically, upward or downward, to better meet the needs of the zones as the cooling and the heating loads change throughout the seasons, as well as day to day. As the various zones begin to call for cooling, it provides supply air just cool enough to meet the cooling needs. As a result, it continually helps to save energy by minimizing the need for reheating out at the zone terminal boxes. Now, let's take a look at another example of simultaneous heating and cooling in air handler systems, where it's not a controls issue, but an equipment issue. This type of problem is hard to spot and often persists unnoticed for years. And again, we have an air handler, but with some slightly different temperatures and parameters. But note that the return air temperature is still 72 degrees, but the outside air temperature has risen to 68 degrees. Notice the outside air dampers are at 100% open now, providing free cooling via the economizer and resulting in a 68-degree mixed air temperature. So far, so good. But now let's take a look at the heating and cooling coils in this system. We can see that the hot water valve is commanded closed, being at 0%, and then that the chilled water valve is commanded to 70% open. Yet this all seems reasonable since the supply air temperature is showing 55 degrees and it's right at set point for this example. But we're in luck with this system because it has an additional sensor just after the heating coil that allows us to demonstrate an important point. When we look at the temperature of that sensor, we see it's reading 74 degrees. Yet we have a mixed air temperature of 68 degrees. So why is there a 6-degree temperature rise across the heating coil while the heating valve is commanded completely closed? Obviously, the valve must not be fully closed and is allowing hot water to leak by, which is adding unwanted heat into the system. This means our cooling coil will open much further in order to drop the temperature from 74 degrees down to the desired set point of 55, and as a result, it's using excessive cooling energy to do it. And yet, checking our terminal units, we see that the zones are still at set point, so the occupants are still comfortable, and nobody notices this is going on. When heating valves leak by like this, it's very important to realize that the controls will automatically open the chilled water valve further, silently compensating for the unwanted heat gain, and will oftentimes still be able to maintain the supply air at set point. So what you need to understand is that this is an issue that's very easy to overlook. This form of simultaneous heating and cooling, where the cooling load is artificially increased by leaky heating valves and then automatically covered up, oftentimes happens unbeknownst to the untrained eye, and it frequently goes on for years. This is why it's so important to regularly scrutinize the system temperatures, keeping an eye out for things like leaky heating and cooling valves, causing simultaneous heating and cooling in your systems. Now, in this example, the valve has been repaired. We can see that by eliminating the leakage, that the cooling load's been substantially reduced. Note the cooling valve has backed off to only 20%, and the cooling load has dropped, thus saving cooling energy, as well as reducing the heating energy that was also being wasted. And as a result, now more cooling capacity has been freed up to be available for handling the real cooling loads that the system was designed for. So if you have hydronic heating water systems, especially ones that are allowed to run when the mechanical cooling is allowed to run, you need to stay on top of this and always be on the lookout for leaky hot water valves and then fix them just as soon as possible when found. And then beware, if your cooling system seems to be mysteriously losing cooling capacity, it may be time to survey all of the heating valves for leak by. I've seen sites where they've had plans to add an additional 1,000 tons of cooling capacity because their chiller plant could no longer keep up with the campus's cooling load, when in fact, they had plenty of capacity to meet the true cooling load. They simply had numerous heating valves that were leaking by, which were artificially eating up much of their cooling capacity, and as a result, significantly driving up energy consumption and cost at the same time. This is an infrared picture of a heating coil that has a leaky hot water valve. The white and red colors are the hottest areas, while the color turns yellow to green to blue as the coil gets cooler. With the valve commanded completely shut as it was, we should have seen the coil being mostly blue and uniform in color, meaning no hot water was leaking by. But by viewing it with infrared, you can easily see that heat is definitely leaking by. Note the white and the red and the yellow areas where the coil is the warmest and how the heat from the hot water that's leaking by the valve dissipates, turning green and then blue as it moves across the coil, and the heat is carried away by the airstream passing through the coil. Thermal imaging is a great tool for quickly identifying leaky heating and cooling coil valves. And here we have another example of simultaneous heating and cooling that often happens. In this example, hot calls are necessitating bringing on mechanical cooling earlier than it should normally be needed. This slide shows a leaky hot water reheat valve out at a terminal box serving a zone out in the building, where the occupants frequently complain of it being too warm and stuffy and often request the cooling system be brought on early. By checking the zone temperature via the BAS system, we can see that the space is reading 76 degrees, which is 4 degrees over set point, so it's no surprise that they're complaining. A quick check of the air handler's supply temperature, and we see that it's sending 62-degree air out to the terminal box, which appears reasonable for the current outside air conditions. Next, we check the reheat valve command to see what it's doing, and we see that it's being commanded closed at 0%, which sounds correct since the zone is above set point. Looks like it's time to head out to the zone and see what's going on out there. Out in the zone, we see that the temperature coming out of the supply diffuser is 75 degrees, which is much warmer than the 62-degree supply air temperature that we would expect to see. So it appears we're getting 13 degrees gain across the terminal box. This pretty much confirms that the reheat valve in this box must be leaking by and will need to be physically checked out for the cause of the problem. Many buildings use terminal units with reheat coils to provide supplemental heat out at the zones. There's oftentimes hundreds of these in a typical building, so chances of one or more leaking by are pretty good. If you have hot water reheat valves, be on the lookout for the zones that are persistently stuffy, and in particular, those that frequently suffer from insufficient cooling ability on warm days. These are common symptoms of leaky reheat valves, and just a little bit of leak by can quickly eat up the cooling capacity of a terminal unit, causing persistent comfort complaints. The common handheld infrared temperature gun works well for quickly identifying issues like these. They also work great for surveying large areas, quickly scanning supply air grill temperatures, looking for supply grills that are substantially warmer than the surrounding ones. But just remember to override the reheat valves closed before scanning them to avoid confusion from any zones that might actually be calling for some heat. And this concludes this presentation. So it's time to get out there and shape up your buildings. And be sure to catch our next and last video in this series, in which we'll be covering control system sensor error and why it's important to keep your critical sensors calibrated. For additional energy saving tips in your buildings, please subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And thank you for joining us today.